Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, I want to have an in-depth look today into the red stats, as a lot of stats are quite misunderstood and a lot of people don't know exactly how they work. To level the playing field a little bit, we'll go stat by stat in this video through the red stats and kind of explain how they work behind the scenes and also how to think of them if they have special traits and how they go into damage calculations if they do. And in doing so, hoping to explain quite a bit of the stats and how they work. In this video, we'll go through the red ones. In a future video, we'll go through the blue and yellow ones together. But in recording this, I already found out that, the red ones by themselves are long enough, way long enough for a video by themselves. Everything will be timestamped down below, so if you're looking for a specific stat, then you can jump to that one. But for the rest of it, we'll go through all of them one by one. So let's go get started. And starting on the red end of things, we'll start with the core, of course, which is weapon damage. Weapon damage as a stat is additive to itself. All of these red cores add together and they go into a stats pool, which is shown here in the offense. So for instance, here, this build has 100% all weapon damage bonus. But then in this same bonus is also what I personally call, am any with me, specific weapon damage. And that's also why we are here with the Lengmo set here with the Bestie set. This LMG damage, this is the exact same pool of stat. So this whole offense area, basically it will have the all weapon damage bonus. So for instance, here me holding the Pestilence, this is part of all weapons. And then specifically as well, it is an LMG, so LMG gets added into that mix. These two get added together and would be, for instance, in this case, calculated as 145 combined weapon damage, or weapon damage in general. And that is important to know. And that means also that these stats are additive to each other. And what that also means is that we'll have diminishing returns within this. Because when you're adding, for instance, in this case, if we have 100 weapon damage already, if we're adding 10% to that, we're not increasing our total damage, the end damage, by 10%. We're only adding 10% to a single stat. So that means that we'll have diminishing returns within that. And for instance, at 100, when we add 10 into it, what we'll get out of it is 5% actual increase. And the way we generally look at it is, what does the actual increase become? An important one as well is that grading goes into this same pool. Some call them buckets as well. When I'm talking about pool, that is the exact same thing. But basically, any of these stats all coalesce into one pool, and then from there they multiply against each other. That is actually how most games do it. In our case, specifically the all weapon damage and the specific weapon damage add together, and then the grading is in that same pool. Same is true, of course, for some of the talents like Optimist and such, feeding into that same pool. And this by itself is an important one to understand, and also the introduction into diminishing returns. And with already just understanding weapon damage, we can also already discuss this stated damage. So this total damage that it says here, this is usually what I call the stated damage of a weapon. And this is just based on the weapon damage and the base of this weapon. Each weapon has a fixed base. There is just a number attached to that set by the devs. There are tables out there where you can find those numbers. So for instance, if we go into the Pestilence, what we can do is show base damage. If we go out, now we have this white number and this orange number. This white number, even though it is truncated here to a 48.3, this is the base damage of the Pestilence. In outside sources, so for instance, I keep my damage tables, there is an exact number for this that we can take. And then the second orange number, this is only your weapon damage. So nothing except your weapon damage is being shown here. So if I'm running a build and it has just red cores, this weapon damage may seem high. But if I'm running a build that, for instance, doesn't have any crits, and for instance is just, a jumbled mess underneath the stats, This weapon total damage that it shows, the stated damage, which is also shown here in full. So you can go into your stats screen and see the full number. And this is also how you back calculate, for instance, to those base damages. This is just based on just weapon damage. So nothing else of the build, not my talents, not that I have crit chance and crit damage mods, and not that I have an Overdog's equip or a Fox's Prayer with its basic stats and stuff. None of those are in here. That makes it so that this number isn't actually that influential. It is just showing what the base damage of the weapon is plus the red cores, and not much else. Then going into total weapon damage, which by the sound of things might seem like is the exact same thing as a weapon damage that we discussed a second ago, but no, total weapon damage is actually a separate thing. So quite often on backpacks, here for instance on this Perfectly Unstoppable Force, we have increases total weapon damage. And what this signifies is that it is a separate multiplier. This is a separate pool. All of the total weapon damages. So for instance, if we were running here Unstoppable Force, I'm running Glass alongside of it. But if I was instead running, let's say, Obliterate, which is also increased total weapon damage by an amount, if we have these two add to the same pool. And to it is basically kind of like a card game system. So the implication and what it's implying here is that it increases the total weapon damage. So it combines the weapon damage and then the total of that is increased by this amount. But by itself, it can be a little bit confusing because, yeah, we have now then all weapon damage, specific weapon damage, those pooled together with grading. And then we have total weapon damage, which is its own separate thing. Total weapon damage, though, mostly comes from talents. There isn't per se sources that we can have it as stats and such. And because of that, it is easy to kind of differentiate them. Generally, if it says increase total weapon damage, those are total weapon damages. Here as well, we'll discuss a little bit about diminishing returns that we talked about a second ago. Diminishing returns just means as we push a stat higher and higher and higher, we'll get less and less returns. So a second ago, we talked about at 100 weapon damage, when we add 10 into it, we'll only get 5 back. So we basically get half in return as our actual damage increase at the end. And this is just as that stat goes up, we're just increasing that singular stat within a whole calculation. So for instance, a separate multiplier coming in is going to add 10% to basically the entirety of our calculation so far. If we're just putting it just in weapon damage, which is just a segment, we're just increasing one segment by 10%. And it is pretty easy to calculate these out. I have a separate video, I'll link to it in the description, simple calcs. I won't go into it here because, yeah, that by itself is a whole separate video, so you can go and watch that one. But for instance then, at 200 weapon damage, if we add 10 there to make it clear, we only gain actually 3.3% on our actual increase at the very end to our build. So as a stat goes higher and higher, we'll get diminishing returns. That by itself is not a problem, because if you have no other choices, then it's fine. The issue becomes that you have to consider that when it comes to its opportunity cost. What else could we pick that maybe goes into a separate calculate or goes into a separate pool in the calculation? And that's, for instance, one of the reasons here where we're taking a total weapon damage backpack and I'm pairing that with a sacrifice. And the sacrifice, of course, is amplified damage. And amplified is a division-specific term, signifying that it is always a separate multiplier. So anything in division land that is called amplified means that it is always its own separate multiplier, effectively its own stat in the background. So for instance, in the case of Glass, all damage we deal is amplified by 30%. But then there are other talents as well that deal in the same way. If we go, for instance, here to Spotter, the wording of it is amplifies total weapon and skill damage. Now, this can be the confusing part because now we're going total weapon damage is in there, but then amplifies is before it. Basically, whenever it is talking about amplifies, it means a separate multiplier. So in the case for Spotter, for instance here, this is a separate multiplier. This will always be this full 15%. And this is the other side of the diminishing return talk, where things that are amplifies, for instance, will never have a diminishing return because they're always at their full amount. So instead of feeding 15% into the middle and just creating one stat becoming a little bit larger in a whole, this is just 15% off the top. So this will always be 15%, glass will always be 30%, and that generally is signified by this amplified. As we'll go to a duo here in critical hit chance and critical hit damage. This is the same basics as a lot of video games use of the chance to critically hit, and then when we do critically hit, then critical hit damage percentage comes into play. In Division Land, we do have a cap of 60 on critical hit chance. This cap is basically locked, with the exception that we have nowadays modifiers. For instance, last season's one increased it by 10%. We've also seen, for instance, having the Red Line Overdrive that we recently had also increasing the cap. So sometimes, due to other things, the cap gets increased. But in general, the cap is at 60 locked. That means that any point over 60 is wasted. This is also from any sources in general play. There are things that can guarantee a critical hit. For instance, the Diamondback by itself can guarantee that you do critically hit, but that is just basically bypassing the system. It is important to understand that this does cap at 60 so that you don't push way too over it. Sometimes pushing a little bit over it is kind of fine. So for instance, in some builds, it is fine to go to, for instance, 61 or such without wasting too much. It is very dependent on the balance between the crit chance and the crit damage. I'll have a separate video that I'll link down below in medium maths and simple calcs that we already actually addressed a second ago. In those, actually, I lay out how to, for instance, balance your crit. The basics of it is that you just take your crit chance as the number that it is there and times it by your crit damage. And then what you take is that you can take several ways that you could have it. So for instance, in this case, we could add a crit chance mod or swap a crit chance or crit damage to a crit chance. We would gain 6 crit chance. We would lose 12 crit damage. You multiply all of the options that you have, and biggest number wins in general. The one thing to remember with that, though, is that, for instance, if we have things like Obliterate, then it might be better to go with something that has a little bit of a lower number, but has a higher crit chance, because those do go from crit chance. Same for Fast Dance, same for Killer and such. So that isn't the end-all be-all method, but at the very least, balancing out your crit can gain you quite often 1 or 2 or 3% of damage. Now, with most cases, if you're above 120, you want to be really close to the crit cap and maybe even a little bit over. But then still, it might be handy to, if you are going over a little bit, to calculate it at, let's say, 55 crit chance with a certain crit damage, and then basically with another crit chance mod in there where you're wasting 1, and then the crit damage that goes with that, and seeing which gives you the bigger number. In general, balancing out the crit is one of the core things to do with a build, and quite often forgotten. And then whenever we trigger that chance, we get a critical hit, and that is where critical hit damage comes into play. Critical hit damage is basically percentage-wise whatever we hit for, percentage-wise on top of it. So if we hit for 100k, and here I have 141 crit damage, we would gain another 141k basically on top. Without, in this case, we have other things mingling into the mix, but at its core. So critical hit damage, it can be just as a separate multiplier, kind of calculated together. And that is actually that calculation we did a second ago of taking crit chance, multiplying with crit damage. And that can actually together become its own multiplier and can be actually used as that within calculations. And that's generally how we do, for instance, average shot, for those familiar with maybe the deeper goings into calculations. So critical hit damage does matter, Because if our chance is very high, but our critical hit damage is pretty low, it might actually be better to lower the chance a little bit and gain that in crit damage. One of the things you may have seen a lot within the division is that generally critical hit damage is twice the value of critical hit chance. And in general, that works out to work out that way as well. So generally you want your critical hit damage to be twice your critical hit chance, but then of course a lot of our builds go way above 120, where crit chance of course caps already. So we can push up critical hit damage quite high. The thing to watch out for here as well is of course the same diminishing returns. Here when we're pushing it really high, let's say with tipping skills, some of the talents choices, for instance, change there. That's one of the reasons with diminishing returns why we consider those things. And that is, together with that, the opportunity cost. At each point, you can basically make one decision. If you take crit damage, you can't have headshot damage there. If you take, let's say, glass, you can't have obliterate there. Things like that are all opportunity cost. And that is actually the thing that really drives choice. So in the case, for instance, with a lot of red builds, we basically just want to balance out our crit, and we're just feeding into crit all the way. And then, of course, for instance, headhunting builds will go with headshots. One of the quirks of Division, and this is very different than a lot of other games, is that critical hit damage and headshot actually in the calculation go into the same pool. So what we get is actually critical hit damage if we also hit a head. Of course, the headshot damage only applies when we hit a head. Those will become additive to each other and diminish each other as well through that when you hit a headshot. But by itself, critical hit damage should be balanced with your crit chance, and is our go-to for a lot of red builds. And then we have, of course, headshot as the other part of that equation as well. So headshot damage will apply by itself whenever we hit a head. And of course, a lot of things, first of all, don't have a head. That's why also crit chance, crit damage is kind of the go-to for a lot of just general use builds. And then headshot especially comes in with, for instance, headhunter and such. But most builds will still have some headshot, and in general play as well, you'll still hit some headshot. So it's well worth considering inside of calculations and how much you have of it as well there. Now, of course, whenever we don't crit and we hit a head, then basically we're getting the headshot damage number applying on top of basically what our weapon damage was hitting for. And this works effectively in the same way as crit. So we can either have a crit, we can either have a headshot hit, or we can have a crit headshot. And each of those will have a different value attached to it. And of course, with headshot and crits going within the same pool, this is just done in this way to kind of keep it in check. Because if these two were separate multipliers to each other, what we actually would want to do is aim a lot more for the heads and kind of balance headshot and crit together. Because they're in the same pool, it actually makes sense to go for one or the other. And that's generally what you see in builds as well. They'll either be set up for crit, or they're going all in on the headshot damage. And going on to armor damage and health damage, the two are very much interlinked, somewhat in the same way as, for instance, crit chance, crit damage is. Now, up to this point, also to clarify, we've just had very normal stats. And when we say normal is that you'll encounter them a lot. So, for instance, the weapon damage is the cores, total weapon damage and such can be from talents and such. Crit is, of course, one of the most common crit chance and crit damage of minor attributes. And then we have talents that, for instance, amplify or do total weapon damage and such. Here in the case of DTA and DTH, as we call them quite often, which is damage to armor and damage to health, it comes from special sources, basically. There isn't that many of them. So, for instance, here we have the Contractors, which is a DTA piece, damage to armor. Then we have, for instance, Hollow Man, that, of course, has damage to health as its special stat. And then, of course, for instance, on the third stat or the second stat of some weapons, we might encounter health damage. We might encounter, for instance, damage to armor on third stats. Now, that means they'll feed into their own pools. Both of those are stats, as they are in the same way as, for instance, weapon damage and such. They just don't have many sources, not as many as the ones we discussed so far. Now, armor damage, very specifically, is when an enemy has the white bars, has basically 2 bars, one on top with armor bars, in the same way that our UI shows our armor. If they don't have white armor bars above it, or you've gone through those, then the remaining, the solid bar is health. That's the easiest way to look at it. That is also why, for instance, armor plates, actually, they are whatever is underneath them. So when you encounter, let's say, a heavy, a tank, a chunga, as a lot of people call them, when you're shooting at them, they don't have actually armor bars above their health bar. And because of that, when you're shooting their armor plates, which is something different than armor damage, that doesn't actually apply just to that, the armor plates are whatever is underneath it. So when you're shooting, for instance, heavy, that is just a health bar, not an armor bar. When you hit its armor plates, it'll just need health damage to increase that. Armor damage will not increase it, even though we call them armor plates. And, well, that's also what they're called by the game itself. The thing to, for instance, remember is that shields that enemies hold, let's say, for instance, the hyenas or cleaner shields, those are also armor plates effectively. They work in the exact same way. But then it doesn't matter actually what the enemy behind them has, because as long as they have armor bars, then it will be damage to armor that will apply extra damage. Once you go through that, then it'll be once they only have health remaining, or if it is, for instance, a red enemy, a veterancy red enemy, then they'll only also have health, of course. So usually veterans and elites have armor bars on top of it, but that's of course not for all archetypes, as we, for instance, talked about. Warhounds and such don't have armor, and they do have armor plates, and because of that, health damage applies to them. Armor damage and health damage are effectively just always active when that prerequisite is there. So when you're shooting at the enemy and they have white armor bars, while they have that, until they, of course, reach the point where you go into their health, the armor damage will be active. And if they never had armor bars, or you've gone through them, now health damage will become active. Now, health damage, of course, very often a prominent source is from ARs. That's also why whenever you're not using ARs, once you go through the armor, you'll feel you go pretty quick through the health if you're running AR, and it feels a lot slower when you're not going with that. These two are also just purely stats, and they will just multiply against everything else. They are their own separate multiplier by themselves. And because of that, they are actually worth quite a lot. A lot of people call these multiplicative. They are not. If we have two sources of armor damage, for instance, here I have already a contractor's glove. I am going to equip this weapon where I have also damaged armor, even though it's not optimized, but that's fine. Those two sources add together. We don't have an 8 and a 5 multiplying each separately, which a multiplicative would be. No, they add together, so they're additive to themselves, multiplying against everything else, which is actually true for all of the things here. Weapon damage, total weapon damage, all of those also, for instance, add together. They're additive to each other and then multiply against the rest. So nothing is special in that way about these stats. It is mostly, though, that you can't get a ton of it because we only have a few sources for damage to armor. We only have a few sources for damage to health. And we only have 2 sources, really, for damage to targets out of cover. And that'll, of course, be our next one, which is damage to targets out of cover. Unlike the other stats, much annoyingly, it doesn't show up here as its own separate one. But we can, of course, account for it from the build. And there is only really 4 sources for damage to targets out of cover. And that is effectively just the weapon, usually on the 3rd stat, on LMGs on the 2nd stat, Fox's Prayer. Then if we have an ally with us in our subgroup with Demolitionist, we also get 5. And then, of course, Smart Cover can also provide a little bit of damage to targets out of cover. Quite often, this gets erroneously called again as well. As with the armor damage and health damage, it's multiplicative. When we have 2 sources of it, For instance, in this case, with the Fox Spur and the LMG having it, it is additive to itself. Meaning that the term multiplicative, that usually means multiplicative to itself, that a lot of other games use in that way, doesn't apply here. That doesn't mean that it is bad, but it isn't because it is multiplicative. It is that it is active quite often, and it is also larger values than some of the other things. So in the case, for instance, of third stats of weapons, one of the things that'll be obvious as we scroll through some of my weapons here in my inventory is that basically all weapons, well, the LMGs have it already as a second stat, but basically all my other weapons have damage to targets out of cover as a third stat. The main reason is because it is 10% worth of it. If we compare that, for instance, to rate of fire, that's 5%. DTA is only 6%. DTH, even though it says 9.5%, is 10%, but that's only, of course, applying to the health of an enemy. Damage to targets out of cover, and to clarify, this is the enemy being out of cover, means that whenever we're shooting an enemy that is out of cover, we're gaining 10% here from this, although of course in an additive sense because we have two sources of it, for instance. But the combined value of 20% that I have here with the LMG and the Fox Spur will apply on top. Now, in the case of cover with enemies, of course, already a lot of dangerous things are already out of cover. So, for instance, heavies and warhounds and such, they don't ever take cover. But then even enemies that are in cover, if you shoot them a few times, generally they get staggered and they get staggered out of cover. And then also, of course, you can just, throw grenades at them. You have some control of getting the enemy out of cover. And on top of that, especially for the weapons third stat, it is then also a large value for that. Because of that, the go-to for third stats is damage to targets out of cover. But then even in, for instance, a lot of builds, it will apply to a lot of things. For instance, in the case of the Pestilence as well, it is important to understand that sometimes we have some of these stats applying also to talents and such. So for instance, damage to armor quite often does apply to things like explosive skills and such. In the case of the Pestilence, damage to armor, damage to health, and damage to targets out of cover, all three actually do interact with the talent on the Pestilence. So that can be actually a thing to consider as well, in the same way that for crit chance, if our talent is reliant on crit chance, we want to maybe reach the cap guaranteed, even if we're wasting a little bit in our balance. This is also the same thing then as well for damage to targets out of cover and, for instance, the Fox Spur. The Fox Spur isn't actually the best in slot in a lot of situations. For instance, for strikers and such, usually Cheska will outperform it, and that then becomes the opportunity cost there. And generally, we reach that conclusion just by calculating things out. Now, in the case of damage to targets out of cover as well, it is actually a really handy stat to have through, for instance, just the weapon, because if we have one source of it, yeah, it'll be that 10%. As we add more on top of it, we can't diminish the damage to targets out of cover just because, as we say, there is very few sources of it. We can't diminish it to all hell, the way that, for instance, with weapon damage, we can. With weapon damage, as we discussed, once we reach, for instance, 100 weapon damage, which is actually for a red build like this already has by itself 145, I believe, 160 even. And that is before adding grading on top, which could take it to 190 weapon damage. At most here, I'll have 20 damage to targets out of cover. And that is the real reason for it being really good. It is a highly active stat in big values in comparison to some of the other things. And then also we can't actually diminish it a lot because there's just very few sources for it. Next up, we'll go into rate of fire. And while here in the library, it shows it as a yellow stat, it is very much a red stat in my mind. While it can also apply to things like our chems and such, and that is, for instance, one of the things that it can be used for, rate of fire by itself is also a separate multiplier effectively within the damage calculation. On the DPS side of things, it is on the other end. So we have all of these other stats feeding into our damage and increasing our damage end of things. Then, of course, we're taking that damage per second, and that means that how many times do we hit that damage in a second. For that, we take, of course, the rounds per minute, and then we divide this by 60. We get rounds per second. and how many rounds we hit for in a second, that's how our average damage is going to be applied. If we increase our RPM by 15%, we're going to increase our DPS by 15% as well. Rate of fire is in the same way as all of the other stats, also additive to itself. So if we have two sources of it, if I were to have it on the weapon, for instance, as a third stat, and then I have it on strikers as well, those two don't multiply against each other, they are additive to each other. So we have 15% from strikers, 5% from the weapon, we have 20% adding together and then multiplying against the RPM of the weapon. Because of that, we can just consider rate of fire as its own separate multiplier. One thing to remember with rate of fire is that when we increase the damage side of things, we're also increasing our ammo capabilities effectively. So how much damage we can do per mag. If we're changing our rate of fire, our damage per mag doesn't change. And ammo conservation and such can be very important. So if we just feed, for instance, if we could put 100% into our rate of fire or 100% into basically increasing our actual damage by 100%, actually putting it on the actual damage side of things would be beneficial, because also with rate of fire, it means we're unloading faster, our firing time is lower, and because of that, we're hitting our reload more often, affecting our sustained DPS. But then, of course, the thing becomes an opportunity costing. Quite often, feeding into rate of fire, for instance, with strikers, here, of course, it is very beneficial. As well, in the same way, we don't have that many sources for this outside of, for instance, if we're taking the chatterbox and we're putting 125% out with that, then yeah, that's one of the bigger increases. But generally, as fixed amounts, we can put it as 5% on our weapon. We can have 15% from strikers. We could even have, for instance, 40% from Umbra. But beyond that, we're not pushing it super far. Rate of fire is very beneficial. Now, of course, rate of fire also has a benefit on the other end. For instance, a stacking build like Striker, it benefits from hitting more often. It is counting hits as our stacks. And because of that, our rate of fire being higher actually helps that side out. So there's always a consideration to be made in that way. But especially understanding as well that, yeah, if we could put it into damage, we would help our ammo conservation is actually handy to know. Next up, we'll go to weapon handling and its constituent parts. Weapon handling is basically a combined stat where 1 point into weapon handling is basically 1 point within stability, accuracy, weapon swap speed, and reload speed bonus. Because of that, it is actually a very valuable stat to have. Now, we can get this, of course, from minor stats. Some gear set have it in the form of, for instance, Striker having 15% of it here. And that 15% can be very impactful. We also, of course, have accuracy and stability already as well from the watch, together with reload speed coming from here as well. So when we get the stats from here, these all just add together. The weapon or the weapon handling will just be additive to these other stats. And we see that as well in our stat screen. So while we have 10% from our watch for accuracy, stability, and reload speed, the 15% weapon handling is coming on top, and we just get 25 on each of these. And let's break down those constituent parts, starting here with reload speed bonus. Reload speed bonus will affect whatever weapon's reload time that we have. So every weapon effectively has its own reload time in the same way that they have a base damage attached to them. And that number is then divided by our percentage of reload speed. So here as a reload speed of 25, this is dividing our base reload time by 1.25 as a multiplier. And whatever number we get out there is already shown here. So this stat screen here will actually get affected by how much reload speed we have effectively from, for instance, having a lot of weapon handling, or some sets have reload speed built in as well. This reload speed is actually very handy, of course. This is one of the parts as well that will go into a DPS, which is the sustained DPS, meaning that weapon handling does affect sustained DPS somewhat. And of course, if our reload time is shorter, the shorter it is, the more time we can spend firing, especially if we consider it in a way where we're just unloading, the shorter that reload time is, the more time we're doing damage instead of being in the reload. Now, of course, quite often as well, you'll get caught out in the reload. Having a little bit of this is actually already very handy. We'll of course always have 10% from our watch. The thing to remember is that with a lot of weapons, for instance with ARs, one of the downsides is when using the big mag, here with the big pouch, using the plus 50 pouch, we don't actually get a minus 10% reload. But of course, a lot of ARs have, if we take the plus 20 round mag, we'll take the minus 10% reload here. And that effectively means that the plus 10% that we have from our watch is, plus 10, minus 10, 0. And then basically just the weapon handling goes over it. It is a very handy stat to consider, but usually just alongside of just getting some of that weapon handling in there. As with weapon handling, but then also from mods and such, we can get accuracy and stability. Now, accuracy and stability are somewhat linked to each other or adjacent to each other. Accuracy, starting with that, is just how close to the center of the reticule the weapon will keep shooting. The bloom of the weapon. As you start firing, so for instance with ARs, as you start firing, first shot basically goes always to the center with ARs. And then from that point onwards, it starts basically spreading out a little bit and going in and blooming. Now with that bloom, that is affected by accuracy. The way that accuracy inherently works means that there is diminishing returns here as well, but just because if we, for instance, have a circle and we take 10% off of that, that actually on the whole, as the coverage of that, is a much smaller area than if we then take that now smaller area and do 10% again. It reduces it by less and less and less. Because of that, there is actually a thing to be said that, both with stability and accuracy, the first amounts that we get from it are very valuable, especially, for instance, not having the watch filled in can feel very painful. But once you have at least that 10%, that helps quite a lot. Adding another 10% helps quite a bit. Adding another 10% still helps. 10% more still is okay. And as we go up and up, it becomes more so there's a point of diminishing returns. There's a point where it's already accurate, putting in 10% and costing, for instance, 5 crit chance at a point is just not really worth it. Now, of course, that's going to be different per weapon types and such, as inherently all weapons have their own accuracy and stability and such. And the bloom of that weapon as well is affected by, for instance, what class it is. SMGs bloom more. LMGs, of course, start very bloomed and then actually become more accurate as they fire, but actually how accurate they can become is affected by the stat. And then, of course, for instance, with things like MMRs and such, this is if you're moving around and then stop and how quickly the weapon becomes accurate, as for instance, if you watch through it with the reticule or with in a scope, you'll see that if you're running with an MMR, come to a halt, aim in right away, you'll see that the accuracy actually stays white for a second and then just snaps to become accurate. How quickly it does that is actually affected by accuracy. And then, of course, we go into stability. What stability does is actually just affect the vertical recoil, so the up and down recoil. It does nothing, actually, against the weapon's horizontal recoil. That is also why, for instance, having a lot of weapon handling and through that, a lot of stability. Shooting, for instance, a Liberty or a Deagle, the D50, it still jumps around a lot on the horizontal axis. From left to right, it jumps still quite a lot. But if you don't have a lot of weapon handling, it also jumps up and down quite a lot. Stability only affects the vertical recoil, and that is actually the only recoil we can affect within the division. Because of that, weapon handling can make it a lot easier to retain a lot of weapons, especially if they are already, from themselves, not very much side-to-side recoily. Some weapons are more so. A famous example is the AUG, and then by extension, the Bighorn, which jumps side to side quite a lot. Even more so, for instance, the Deagle, as we discussed a second ago, jumps around to the sides a lot. And And that also means that having a lot of weapon handling, some weapons actually will benefit a lot more from that. If we, for instance, consider something like the Lexington, which really only has a horizontal, or basically has no horizontal recoil, but mostly has a vertical recoil and kind of straight up as well, that actually benefits a lot from stability. We, of course, get a little bit from our watch once we have that. And then, for instance, in this case, I was running Striker. And actually, that in the same way as with accuracy, that first bit that we actually get is the most impactful, as this is, of course, just basically in the same way kind of shortening our vertical recoil up. Because of that, we don't need to recoil compensate as much. But it being a percentage-based amount, it means that is dividing basically between each shot as it goes up. And because of that, in the same way as accuracy, it has diminishing returns effectively. Going from 25 to 50 doesn't mean that you actually basically half the length of firing upwards, basically, the vertical recoil. It quarters it. And that is just a result of how it's calculated at. Because of that, the first bits of stability are really impactful, and as you add more and more, it'll actually impact it less, especially to a weapon that already has a lot of horizontal recoil. In the case of MMRs, this is also the sway. Actually, in all scoped weapons, this is also the sway. But of course, in MMRs, there it matters. Having a lot of stability on some of the MMRs through weapon handling or through stability mods can make it so that with a lot of weapons, you can actually have them have no sway. And that can actually be very nice, especially with MMRs. But stability is one to go for, especially true weapon handling, where we can get accuracy, stability, weapon swap speed, and the reload speed bonus as well. And next up, we'll go to weapon swap speed. Importantly, actually, for some of the veterans, this has been fixed. If you're under the assumption that it wasn't, it's not working currently within the game. For a long time, for years, this stat did not do anything, but nowadays it does again. Weapon swap speed affects how quickly you go between weapons. Now, this isn't that impactful, of course, because how often do you really swap weapons? With some things, though, that can matter. So especially going to and from the specialization weapon is really affected by this, as that swap is actually very long, of course. Nowadays as well, of course, we do have things like the quick step. Now, with the quick step, if we, for instance, put it on the weapon, and swap speed has become my go-to for the second stat on this pistol, as it only affects it when we're on the pistol itself. All of the stats, generally for weapons, are only active when you're on the weapon itself. So if we have it, for instance, on gear, so Legatus is, of course, where we can have some swap speed, that would affect all of our weapons. Having this just on the pistol means when swapping to the pistol, I have whatever weapon handling I have effectively here, from it being strikers and getting 15% from there as I'm running that here. But then if I do equip this pistol, when I'm holding the pistol and swapping back to my main weapon, we're doing so a little bit faster as well. If we swap to the stats on the pistol, then we see that it's 30% now. In some places, interestingly, this can actually be useful. In Hollywood, actually, I run a Legatus chest, and that's to swap over to the grenade launcher a little bit faster, because in Hollywood, using the specialization weapon and being able to swap to it quickly and then back to a main weapon to kill whatever hasn't died to that grenade launcher is kind of the go-to for me. So actually, this does get used sometimes, and same here, for instance, for the quick step. And we'll go to magazine size, and then in a second as well, ammo capacity. Magazine size increases our magazine size as stated there. Now, this is a percentage increase through magazine size. The thing to remember is actually that when we do it with magazines, or for instance, in this case, the pouch here on the weapon, we're actually adding a fixed amount. So if we go to, for instance, an AR here, the CTAR, if I go to the magazine of it, it doesn't say plus this percentage rounds. We get plus 20 rounds or plus 15 rounds. And of course, if we don't take any, we have a base amount of the weapon, which is 30, as we see there. These are fixed absolute values. That magazine size is a percentage increase. Now that means though that actually if we add in absolute values, it first calculates whatever the absolute values are together. So for instance, we have 50% mag, and then we get ammo capacity, or we get magazine size off of that amount. So having a larger base magazine together with the mag that we put in to get plus absolute number rounds, that means that our increase from that percentage is much larger. In many cases, going for this stat is actually pretty detrimental. Generally, if you could do more damage, and that's the opportunity cost side of things, if we can do more damage in the same or less rounds, basically, the better that is. For instance, going 2-piece Brazos with a Ninja Bike, which is a somewhat often seen striker, means that you're foregoing having more damage things. We could have the Striker backpack, we could have Cheska, we could have a Coyote or a Tinkerer alongside of that. Because of that, actually, in the same time span, on the DPS end of things, it's doing less damage. The only thing it gets is that it gets to fire more rounds, but each of those rounds is doing less damage. That's why generally we don't go for magazine size unless it comes alongside of something else. So for instance, in the case of tipping skills is a place where the magazine size is kind of a bonus, a cherry on top, alongside of a lot of other gear set bonuses. And then alongside of magazine capacity is ammo capacity. A lot of people quite often conflate the two. It is very important to understand that magazine capacity increases the magazine of the weapon that you're holding, so the amount of rounds that you have. The ammo capacity is how many rounds you have in total. So without this ammo capacity on the watch, we have a lot less rounds in reserve. Because of that, we'll have to go and pop ammo boxes more often and such. But this doesn't affect the amount of ammo that we have inside of the gun as part of the magazine size. This stat does come in a few flavors. Of course, we get some from the watch. We get some, for instance, if we go True Patriot, but you really shouldn't. But there we also get magazine size. It can be very handy. And for instance, actually recently, I've been playing a character that doesn't have the watch, kind of on purpose to kind of get the feeling for it. And this is actually one that I miss quite a lot because I run out of ammo much more often. Ammo capacity generally is not something we spec towards anyway. This would just be the reserves. And in the end, you might as well just go grab more ammo instead of trying to spec into this. And with that, we come to the end of this long look into the red stats and explaining how they work. I hope it was informative and helps out in some ways, as I know a lot of these traits that we discussed in this video are not known to everybody, so it is hopefully helpful. If it was, please do any and all algorithm things down below, as it does help out, so I'll do that little bit of shilling here. For future videos, we're going to go into that Pistol Headhunter build showcase. I'll likely follow this up not too long, as I do want to still get it out while the harvest is harvestable. And we'll of course go into the blue and yellow stats variants as well and explain all of those, as especially there, I feel a lot are misunderstood. So yeah, I hope you join me for those, and as always, have a good night.